and officially welcome anyone who's listening on the recording. Are you here? We are live during Brain Awareness Week 2024. This is an open house about our lab, and it's primarily designed to just sit here and for myself and Emily and Yvonne and McKenna and anyone else from our lab who's able to come tonight, just to answer questions about what it is we do. It's probably unclear to you, many of you, what it is a Neurolaw lab does when you understand what the law is and what it means to practice law, and you might have a sense of what it means to do. Many of you are practicing in the sciences and running experiments, but what does it mean to work at those intersections, and how does neuroethics enter into it, and all those sorts of questions we can talk about. I only want to show, like I said, 2 minutes worth of slides because I really don't think that we should sit here and have me do a presentation. I have a lot of presentations, and you can see those in other places. So let me just kind of ground our conversation in what it is our lab is focused on. So I'm going to share my screen with this one over here. Can you all see the slides? Yeah. Okay, so our lab motto is every story is a brain story. And if you've heard me talk before, you know that I think there are two caveats to this. So caveat one is that every story is not just a brain story. We are not in the business of trying to rule out all other fields and say neuro. Rather, we recognize that the traditional social science fields like economics and history and political science and sociology, those fields are tremendously important for policymaking, for the law, but neuroscience is not a part of those conversations. So when you say every story is a brain story, the point is not that every story is just a brain story, but that neuroscience might have a lot to offer. Areas like education policy or criminal justice policy, or this week we're doing a program with colleagues who do neuroarchitecture work. That's the point, that brain science should have a seat at the table. The second caveat is that at present, and again, many of you know this very well, it's what you do in your work, what you've studied, every story is a poorly understood brain story, or at least many of them are. And it's really frustrating, whether you or a family member or just someone you know or patients you work with have certain mental disorders or brain disorders. It's really frustrating because you're like, we don't have much of a cure for Alzheimer's disease. Boy, we've been studying addiction for 4+ decades. And by the way, scanning the brains of addicts for 4+ decades. And yet we still have massive challenges in just understanding the mechanisms of addiction, let alone how to treat it. And this uncertainty turns out to be a really big part of what we do, because it'd be really easy if neuroscience had all the answers for the law, but it doesn't. Law is in the business of governing human behavior, and neurolaw is built on two pillars, in my view. Pillar number one is what I just mentioned. The law is in the business of governing human behavior. I mean, that's just sort of what it does. And in doing that, it considers all sorts of mental questions, like what were they thinking? Like, will this intervention help or hurt this individual? And, on down the line. And then pillar number two is that neuroscience might tell us something important about the way we make decisions and the relationship between decision making and action. That second part is just like Neuro 101. It's what you had in high school neuro if you had it. Certainly, many of you are majoring in neuroscience. That's an unstated assumption. It's like, well, of course, mental stuff is facilitated by brain stuff. It wasn't always the case, but you put those two pillars together. The law cares about the decisions we make and how we behave. Neuroscience seems to be a field that studies how we make decisions and how we behave, and there ought to be a marriage. And that's what we do. So we focus on two big questions. On one hand, we focus on the leveraging information from neuroscience to improve the law. That might be new technologies, it might be new insights. And in doing so, we encounter a lot of ethics questions. We also encounter, by the way, a lot of AI, because neuroscience is relying heavily on AI. Talk about that also if you want to. But there's a flip side. There's another area that we focused on, the second big question, and that is, how can law and its regulatory function, here I include law and legislation and policy, unleash the power of AI and the power of neuroscience while mitigating potential harms? And that's where a lot of, say, the AI conversation is right now, but it's also the neurotech conversation. And again, that also involves a lot of ethics, because you've got to think about well, how exactly do we know what's right? What kind of world do we want? We do all kinds of stuff, and I presume we'll talk more about this. We do a lot of community engagement work, being out in the field, being in legislatures, a lot of policy work. We've had a lot of collaborations. I won't go into them. A lot of research assistants that power all the work. I could talk for another 5, 6, 7, 10 hours about our work, but that is not the point of tonight. So I'm going to stop there. And this is totally open to anything you want to ask, cover. There's no set agenda. Let me just ask if either Emily or McKenna or Yvonne want to say anything else before we jump into it. No? Okay. All right. The floor is collectively yours. So don't be bashful. This is your chance. Better to ask now than wait for my email replies because we're buried in emails. I apologize if I haven't replied to some folks. Okay, we have multiple hands now raised. All right, so I'm going to go just in the order that I see them. So Vidya, hi, welcome, and
Yeah,
thanks for being here.
thank you so much for this. I had a couple of questions. Just in this like intersection of law and neuroscience, how do we think about, like pain in the law, especially because myself I have chronic pain, so that's a really fascinating like intersection and caveat of neuroscience that I was thinking about when I was looking at your lab, and also I saw some of your work on portable and external neuroimaging, and I was wondering how, thinking of it in a public health perspective, right, where it's sort of like, how do we like promote the sustainability of this technology in communities to empower and improve like the health of these like of communities that are rural, like disabled populations, refugee populations, for example. So this may be a little off track from what exactly this.
Okay, so I think I got most of the questions. It was I know it's cutting a little in and out. So really briefly, both of those issues are very important issues in the law. I'm going to pop in the chat. We and in our a couple of things that'll be relevant. So first on pain, pain in the law is a big area. The reason it's a big area is that of course, obviously, medicine and pain is a big idea because people want to be relieved of their pain, but it has implications in the law because it's costly when you're in pain and you have to pay things like doctor's bills and prescriptions. And sometimes you are concerned with the person who caused or allegedly caused your pain, and you want to sue them and again get monetary damages to account for your pain and suffering. I was participating in a conference that actually some of you are at University of Maryland. So Amanda Pristilnik is a wonderful law professor there, a neurolaw professor, and she's done some of the best work here. It's a little older at the conference, but I pasted in the link in the chat. It might be interesting. Our lab has written on issues related to what counts as physical or bodily injury. The law and society make a big distinction, I think problematically so, between physical pain and mental pain on the other hand. And neuroscience, of course, has something to say about that. There's one other place actually. Okay, so that's pain. Let me put in portable MRI. With colleagues across the country and even the globe, we do work on the ethical, legal, and social implications of highly portable MRI. I'll put that link in there, and we had a great you can see videos from. Let me get the we did a big program in December here at Minnesota on that. So those are some of the places that I think are exciting to work because the neuroscience is rapidly changing, emerging, and law and ethics have to keep up. I could say a lot more. I think I won't. I'll just ask anybody know what Supreme Court case over this past year um, had briefs that cited neuroscience of pain. What high profile US Supreme Court case had briefs that cited neuroscience of pain? Anybody know? Unmute if you do, just say hi. Winnie, you know?
Is it Dobbs?
It was Dobbs. So Dobbs is the obviously high profile, and depending on how you feel, greater. not so great case related to regulation of termination of pregnancies. And of course, the law has to figure out when does a certain group of cells require legal protections and what sorts of legal protections. By the way, we're groups of cells. I don't mean that to demean anyone. It's kind of the cool thing, right? Read Francis Crick, Nobel laureate, the astonishing hypothesis. Our brains are, a bunch of cells and they do really cool things together. And in any event, one of the arguments offered based on neuroscience of pain, though of course countered by the other side, was, hey, it's tough to draw lines in the law. Let's draw the line where we think that group of cells can start to experience pain. And they reference neuroscience of pain. So great question. There's a lot of neuroscience and pain. We do a limited amount of work on it in our lab, but others do a lot of work on it. We got a chapter on it in our casebook, and glad you asked. Okay, those are and then for portable MRI, again, I could talk all night about it, but I'll put those links in there for now. If people want to talk more, I'm happy to. Let me go back on this list and see who's next. So I think Carter is next on this queue, followed by Hannah.
Hi, thank you. I'm sure there's going to be lots of great questions about the technical points of your research, but I wanted to ask sort of a logistical question. Since the nature of your work is so interdisciplinary and you have research assistants from all different backgrounds, medical school, law school, high school even, how does it work with doling out the work and fostering like collaboration between these different sorts of backgrounds? How is that handled in your lab? And maybe if some of the research assistants could speak to that experience as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say maybe they should answer that. I'll just say at a high level, and then I turn it over to the rest of to the RAs here and to Emily. We try and align a task with skill sets, and we try and hire. So we have multiple law students on this group, and law students that you could not do legal research the way you can now when you were a junior in college. You just can't. On the other hand, and you can't do medical research, right? So we only have medical students. So that's my general principle. And then we try and work together in teams. So, but do any of our group want to say anything about that? Yvonne, Emily, we don't have Sam because HLS, Harvard Law School, is on break this week. So Sam's not here, one of our law students, but
I think I can kind of speak to the temporal kind of collaboration of it. We have a lot of students, a lot of people who are working full-time jobs. So the schedule is both very flexible and allows for a lot of communication. So I think right now, for example, all the RAs are doing one-on-ones each week with both Dr. Shen and myself. And on top of that, we have a lab meeting. So I just find it's like a combination of really having a very flexible schedule on a day-to-day basis so that you can work alongside like whatever other commitments that you have, and like frequent points of contact so that everybody feels like they're in community with each other and everybody's kind of on the same page.
McKenna, you want to say anything? Or Yvonne?
You think they made it?
Yeah. Oh, Yvonne, you go.
Are you sure? Okay, so I think Dr. Shen kind of touched on it well about how he matches up the task to our skill set, but there's also a sort of hierarchical process going on. So, for instance, there's a task that me and McKenna worked on where we were coding it for an article, and then that once we were done with the coding, that got passed on to Dr. Shen and one of the medical students to write an article about. So there's collaboration in the sense of again we have tasks that match our skill set, but it also aligns. Not all the time. Like you have some projects that are completely separate. But a lot of times it can align, like I just mentioned, that task got passed on to people who were, I suppose, had more qualified to work on the next level of the task, and then that's kind of how we sort of foster a collaborative environment.
Did you want to say anything, McKenna?
Yeah, sure. I would just add that like I've had a really wonderful experience like working with so many people in these different backgrounds. Like we each bring our own like unique approach and skill set, but we're all ultimately kind of interested in this neuroscience, usually in the lab law or ethics space. And so I think particularly in working on the career network where we're like trying to foster the growth of these fields, I found a really great like community in collaborators and like for example, like 2 months ago, we wrote a commentary to one of Dr. Shen's articles, like all the RAs, just because like we were really excited by the work like he's doing and wanted to respond in our own way. And so there's always opportunities for additional work or growth. And like the lab can find projects that kind of match your interest areas. So
Yeah, and Emily made a good point about flexibility. So we have no money in the lab, and the reason there's no money is that it's really, really difficult to fund interdisciplinary work like this. When I say no money, that's not entirely true. We've been able to get grants, but we're not we're not flush. And it's the other reason is that these are really new fields. So the analogy I usually make is to music, or startup companies where you're kind of working out of your garage and you know you're going to hit it big, or you hope you're going to hit it big, but not yet, you know. Now I have seen slow and really actually more than steady, really increasing interest, especially from younger cohorts. But you know, law has been around for centuries and centuries, and it didn't need neuroscience. And so, and as I mentioned before, neuroscience has been really frustratingly slow. But we're betting on it, and I think, you know, there's just great interest in it. But it means that the reason I mentioned for the RAs is that so everyone has like another gig usually, with the exception we've been able to grow, and so Emily is full time, which is great. And we'll have some other full-time postdocs hopefully soon. But it's not like a lab that does cancer bio where you just know, okay, this is going to be well funded for a long time. We have to generally make the case. Like the first question, if you're in cancer bio, is like, why are you studying cancer? That's not the question. The first question we generally get is like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? So that's fun. I mean, that's why we're doing it. So it's a lot. I like doing it that way. But I think we have a self-selected group of students, certainly the three that are here, and the whole bunch of folks who are willing to take a bit of a risk. But we try and have a lot of fun with it too. Okay, so Hannah, I think, is next. Great question. Thank you, Carter.
So my question is more about your research. So using AI in like field of law and neuroscience can sound as a threat to people. Like what would be the first reactions? Because like this year, as you may know, in Canada, they are passing like a new law about expansion of medical assistance in dying to people with mental disorders. And like talking about life and death. And there were some articles about how AI or artificial intelligence can help us in making decisions related to this field and like the eligibility of people for these kind of decisions. So, like, do you think that would take away the autonomy of people? Like, are we doing research in order to take away the autonomy of people in their decision making, or does this sound like a threat to people who don't know about the field? Like, how would be the first reactions?
Yeah, great question. So I teach at Harvard. Well, actually, we've got some students here in the class. In our Master's of Bioethics program, a bioethics and AI course. So we just wrapped up actually, and you know, the question you asked is a really good one, a really difficult one. It was one of the themes of the course, sort of, is AI the, you know, promise to make everything better and wonderful, or is it a sign of the apocalypse? And I would be somewhere in the middle of those two. I'm not concerned that the introduction of AI in health and in other spaces in the law, the criminal law, is necessarily going to lead to, you know, massive injustice or reduction of autonomy. On the other hand, I'm not sold that, and these are speaking really broad strokes, and it really depends on what particular type of algorithm or artificial intelligence in a particular application. But in really broad strokes, I also am not convinced that it will sort of fulfill the promise that it sometimes offers. So specifically in the medical assisted and dying context, the MAID laws, I have a colleague named Jennifer Chandler, who's an amazing professor, Canada. You know, people should look up her work on this issue. And it's really, really thorny. Even if before you get to AI, for those who don't know these laws, they are expansions of the idea that the way we sort of respect autonomy is to give people more decision-making power, especially about how they end their life. Traditionally, not all, but say many, and majority of societies have looked down on taking one's life. Indeed, there are the states, most of the United States still have criminal laws on the books for suicide. And I say, how do you, well, you can have attempted suicide. You could theoretically be charged and convicted of that. And many U.S. states and Canada have, and others across the world have thought about, well, what about the context where someone has a terminal disease? And the basic logic is, I have stage, X cancer. I only have 3 months to live. Rather than have my last days of life be this horrible experience, let me choose my own way to leave this world. Okay, and that's kind of the part of the idea. The challenge is that how far do you expand that, and how far is your slippery slope? What if somebody says life just really sucks right now, and it sucks in part because the government won't support me in the ways that I think, or I'm down on my luck, kind of what you're suggesting, or I just don't want to live with this brain disorder, this mental disorder. I don't want to live with Alzheimer's. I don't even want to get to the point where I have Alzheimer's. I've got an indication that it's. So those are really thorny questions. They take a lot longer to answer them. And I think, in my view, Hannah, that AI just raises the stakes a little bit, but it doesn't change some of the foundational questions in that context. But it's a great question. I wish we had a little more time to talk about it. Glad you're thinking about it. I see a lot
Thank
more
you.
hands. Let's try and get to them all. Okay, it's Rabia. Did I pronounce it again? I know you told me, and now
Oh, it's all right. It's all right. Pronounce it right. So I was just going to ask, do you think the use of biomarkers and the identification of common brain structures could yield bias in law?
could yield bias in law. Potentially. What do you mean by bias? What are you thinking?
Bias, I mean, for instance, there have been articles that have come up and they've identified these biomarkers in individuals with Alzheimer's disease. And oftentimes, in individuals with neurodegenerative diseases, often individuals will have families that would say, I want to be the primary caregiver for this person because their health is in decline. And oftentimes that causes a legal issue because the person believes that they're losing autonomy. And the thing is, how this intersects with neuroscience is people want to use biomarkers to see how capable individuals are in making decisions for themselves. And a problem is these biomarkers, even in criminal law, could cause some bias because it might try to put all these individuals in the same scenario, but often people's experiences are their own. You can't put everyone in the same sack. That
Yeah,
makes
okay, great set of questions. So first of all, you're right on the mark. We're moving towards more bio and digital markers for mental disorders. And actually, Yvonne and McKenna are just working on we had a meeting this morning about some of those issues. At present, I think most of you know that in psychiatry, clinical psychology, we rely on self-report and behavioral symptomology for defining and then assessing one's mental illness if they have it. That's really different from many other areas of medicine. I mentioned cancer. Let me make an analogy to a distinction from cancer. So the reason we have screening in cancer, breast cancer screening, prostate cancer screening, is that you look fine and you feel fine, but we check out and boy, there may be some cells in your body that are not so fine. And then we intervene, right? The whole point is to use biomarkers. You look at the cell, you do a biopsy. Is it benign or is it not benign? Is it malignant? And then you intervene. We don't do that with the mental disorders that are in the American Psychiatric Disorder, the Bible, sometimes called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health. You don't have the mental disorder unless you have the behavioral symptomologies. You could have a funky brain, so long as you're behaving fine, what we care about. And what you're picking up on is that we're moving into a world, Alzheimer's is actually the leading cutting edge of this, we've written on it, where rather than define the disease based on symptoms, what you're consciously aware of, what others can see, we define it based on biology, on biomarkers, what's going on in your blood and your brain. And we might use digital biomarkers too. I do think there's potential, if this is not done well, for a lot of negative consequences. I could see discriminatory practices. I can see just a lot of concern because we've never really been in a situation where we can see things probabilistically changing in our brain, see things changing in our brain that make it probabilistically more or less, but more likely that we're going to develop a certain mental illness or mental disorder or behave in a certain way because the brain is so tightly protected in the skull. And again, for the vast majority of human history, we haven't been able to see inside the skull until you die and we cut it open. So yeah, I think biomarkers in the law are a major issue. We've been trying to track that, and it's another place actually where AI intersects things because again, and you probably in like Neuro 101, remember Phineas Gage, right? You know, many of you remember Phineas Gage. The reason Phineas Gage was so easy to like so important is that you didn't need anything advanced. It's like the dampening rod went right through his brain. You saw exactly where the lesion was. And there's a certain logic to it. AI is being used because you gather all this data. You don't know where very different methods, and now you're trying to figure out what's going on inside the brain. And so I think you get to a point where rather than show a brain image, oh, here's the tumor, here's the difference, it's, well, I can't really show it to you on a scan, but I could tell you that the AI system has identified abnormal circuitry, and therefore let's make some predictions based on that. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of potential harm there. There's also a lot of potential good. We right now wait till the volcano generally erupts with mental illness and mental orders before we intervene, because how could we know any different, right? We don't have any other way of knowing, and potentially, again, in the longer run, these digital biomarkers, these wearables and implantables someday, maybe that changes the game. Great set of questions. We could talk more too. Okay, I'm going to give shorter answers so we can get through a bunch more questions. And I want to get to some of these practical questions as well. I see one in the chat. So Daniel, talk to us.
Yep, I want to discuss something that one of my professors brought up. I'm currently working under him, and he brought up the fact that sometimes neural networks have similar characteristics to how human beings learn. And I'm not saying that it's going to turn into a Skynet situation or anything, of course, but I was wondering what those similarities you might have seen yourself in your lab might be.
Well, I'll say a couple things in answer to your question. I mean, one is we don't do, and this is actually, I think, one of the questions too, or something like it in the chat. We ourselves don't conduct neuroscience experiments. We collaborate with a number of people who do. So we've, worked with fMRI imagers, and we've taken behavioral stuff that we've run and run it in the lab while people are getting scanned. And we, in our NIH grants, we have multiple NIH grants, we're in close collaboration, for instance, with a group to try and improve the representativeness and diversity of those who get scanned. I work on an NIH Bridge to AI project where, we're in meetings every week or every other week with the engineers and the quants and everything else. But we ourselves don't run those models or develop those models. So in part, I'd say, I don't know, I have to rely on my colleagues. The second thing, I'll just segue quickly to take on one of these other questions, is sort of like, what's the combination of stuff that we do? So it's in part based on where the funding is, but I'd say we're 80% law, 20% ethics, and we are 70% neuro and 30% AI would be my guess. But that could change. And in fact, it might be not AI, but maybe it'd be something like quantum mechanics or some sort of this sort of stuff that I think is coming down the pike. I think we'll stick with neuroscience as a long play because it hasn't matured yet. It hasn't come anywhere close to maturing yet. In fact, it's been really disappointing, I think, for the most part, in a lot of ways. But I think that's going to change. Now, I don't know how long it will take, and it might take more than my lifetime. But we'll double down on neuro. I think the payoff is huge, and I'm not running an investing firm, so I can wait it out. But I'd say that's our mix, and then the last mix, I'd say that we do about 30% original, like empirical work. That's probably shifted over time. We do a little less than we do, and then 75-ish% more. I'm just making these things up, but I think about right. Collaborative work. We're brought in as the ethics or the legal team with groups that are doing cool cutting edge science. And then of late, we've really picked up this Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. That's become a real passion project. I would just say we've added that on top of everything else. I don't think it's replaced anything. I think we've just added it on. And the reason that I started that, and so glad that Emily's on board and Ken and Yvonne and everyone else, is that if you go to these meetings and and neuroethics and neurolaw, and just the same people again and again and again. And that was really concerning to me. It's really cool hearing all the places you're coming from and all the schools, because that was another thing too. I'm like, all right, well, where are they teaching law and neuroscience? Well, it's just a handful of schools. Has anyone ever heard of these fields? No. How would you get involved? I have no idea. There's not a single person on my campus who does this. So we've really spent a lot of time this past year to start this new career network. We're doing events, all spring. So that's a passion project that I've tapped on the rest. But our core research program, I think, probably breaks out like that. But we'll go where the technology goes to some extent also, and try and lead it if we can. Okay, Pavan.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Sen. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity. So I'm dialing from Singapore. So my question is more around we just heard about the bias part, biasness plus the decision making, the discriminatory processes that may happen. So do we have, or are we thinking of making some training programs or specifically specialized on the execution part? When I say execution part, it is more on, for example, lawyers and judges. Are they trained well enough to understand the limitations of neuroscientific studies, or the limitations around this interdisciplinary studies that we do, or around the data privacy part? Because there is neuro privacy also, the data can go into wrong hands. So are we also thinking of some training specialized programs around that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to be really quick. I wish I could go longer. We do a lot of education and outreach training programs, especially for judges and lawyers. We just did a great program. Emily was with us, where we had a group of about 25 to 30 Massachusetts state judges. And we were with them for a year and did a series of programs to really try and improve learning and engagement in two-way. So it's not just, oh, hey, neuroscience, we have all the answers. We're going to teach you judges and lawyers what to do. It was also, what does the legal system need from neuroscience, broadly defined, neuroscience and related fields. So we do a lot of that work. With respect to AI as well, I would say that, and it's going to kind of looks like one of the questions. I just had a lunch kind of conversation today with the judge who, they're utilizing AI. It's about to take off in the legal system as legal tools. So people are really aware of it. It's happening really quickly. And I think the big questions will be, what are the guardrails that need to be in place, and that's where the law gets involved. So this stuff is happening in a lot of really great. We are not at all the only group doing the law and AI stuff. But we were out ahead of it, I will say. So you can search actually with a student, Brendan Johnson and I wrote Teaching Law and AI as a little article a number of years ago, and said more schools ought to be teaching this. I think law and neuroscience is more under the radar right now. We are not in the headlines. There are no Super Bowl ads about neuroscience, as there were about AI, but there weren't any ads about AI a decade ago either. So, and in fact, there were multiple called AI winters. I don't know if you ever heard this phrase, where in the 50s and then beginning in the 80s, sort of AI is going to change everything, and then it doesn't. And people are like, oh, voice recognition is still horrible. It's never going to happen. What are you, crazy? You're never going to have self-driving cars. That's just a pipe dream. So I think, and to me, the neuro stuff is much more game changing than AI. And of course, I don't want to distinguish them, because they work together in a lot of ways. But I say it's a great set of questions. I'm sorry I can't give a longer answer. I am going to put in one other group that I work with, which is a Bridge to AI project, just to give you a sense of kind of the things that we do. So that project, we're part of the ethical and trustworthy AI team with many others. We're kind of a small bit player, but trying to think about, when you're bridge to AI, is the ideas from NIH, is that we're creating the bridges to a future where AI is going to be everywhere, and what are the types of protections that you'd want to have. And we try and do the same thing with neuro. And you're right that there's not a full understanding. So we try and improve that where we can, and again, and learn from judges and lawyers. Okay, I think let me see who's next on this list. Cole, then Cameron, Tom, Nicole, Winnie, Anna. See if we can get to everybody.
Hi, thank you. So I know we're running short on time. I'll just try to get the question out quickly. So with biotechnology evolving so fast, like Neuralink and CRISPR kind of come to mind, and with like the possible acceleration of advances in these things due to AI, I'm curious if you think that there's sort of a risk that the law will sort of stifle research and like advances in these areas, and which could lead to like bioethical concerns. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Say, how would it stifle? What are you thinking?
Um, like with AI, I think what like example with AI is like people may be afraid, like people may be cautionary on what we do. Like it's better to be cautious than to just sort of see what we can do. You know what I mean? So if
I
we,
see. Yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
I do think that's a concern. I mean, and that's what the regulatory frameworks are trying to balance. And it's not new to AI. So FDA has in the US and similar governing bodies in other parts of the world are always trying to balance consumer protection versus so protecting consumers and citizens from really problematic drugs and devices, whether they're AI or not, versus letting people make their own decisions. So there's sometimes in the states called these right to try laws, where the basic law. Have you heard of these laws before? The
yeah,
basic idea is right. At least let me try. Let me make the decision, like me individual make a decision.
hmm
Of course, and at least in the modern era, we rely on agencies, state and federal, or maybe even global, to give us some help and protect us from ourselves. Like, how are we going to know whether a particular product, is safe to use or not? We just want to all guess and check. Doesn't seem like a great a great model, and so we create these regulatory structures. And some AI will go through that, some will not. I think in law, as distinct, say, from health, the issues are a little bit distinct in that health has a sort of pretty clear bottom line. That is, don't hurt humans and try and improve human health. They might disagree about how to do that, but by and large, there's agreement. Law is adversarial in its nature, and so tools that help, say, criminal prosecutors maybe favor AI tools, may be favored by prosecutors, and really, defense attorneys may be less interested in, and they just disagree sort of about what a system should look like. And that goes back to this, if I'm not going to put it up, but these arrows of like, how should law regulate neuro and AI? There's a deep ethical question. It's like, well, what do you want the world to look like? And we sometimes have to get involved in those things. The discussion we had in our last class was about whether humans should be at the center of bioethics, or to what extent non-human entities someday should be as well. What is it that makes humans special, if anything? And we had a real range of views. Right now, if any of you have taken any ethics, it's humans, 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 and then sometimes non-human animals, like animal ethics. And then everyone else is like basically the same as everything else, I guess, is the same as toasters. It's like, you don't like randomly just throw a toaster, but it's really not we're not concerned about toasters. But when toasters get really, really smart and they're no longer toasters, but we read, if any of you have read Isaac Asimov's short stories, I, Robot, we read the first one in there called This Robot Robbie. And, basically the tension is, what if your best friends are robots? And we have students writing on, should the law recognize marriage between basically robots and humans? And it's a really tough question. Like initially, when people think about robot human marriage, some of the gut instinct is like, that's just crazy. First of all, that's just crazy. Second of all, we've never done that. And then you think about, well, how would you raise the kids? And what's interesting is that it kind of parallels some of the gut check reactions that were held, relatively recently, or continuing by some for same-sex marriage. Kind of like, what? That's crazy. We've never done that. It'll harm the kids. Like all this other stuff. And it's like, okay, what? So, the student is trying to work out like, what is it that that is unique about humans? So I think those types of questions, Cole, are really like embedded in the question, like how do you unleash and what are you unleashing onto society? And we'll
yeah,
get there with brain machine interface and cognitive enhancement, which are brain questions. That's the thing about, it's Brain Awareness Week. So that is like the starting point of our lab's work and the mission. give a talk where I just try and remind everyone that we know that the brain's really important, but we have all this language that kind of makes it easy to forget because we say, oh, use your brain when you do your math homework, right? Like that's okay. Well, yeah, that kid's got a lot of brain power. But then we're like, oh yeah, have a heart-to-heart conversation, matter of the heart. You got to have heart, Come on, it's the fourth quarter. Let's play with some heart. The heart pumps blood. To say that the heart is the heart of, say the heart is, the center of any of that is his basic equivalent to say the earth is flat. And people would have, oh yeah, I know that. It's just a term. It's just language. But the language kind of, I think obscures the picture because once you realize that, then you can start to get a little more sophisticated about it. Because then you're like, let's play with some heart, which actually means let's have some circuitry going on in the brain and the rest of the body that's a certain way. Then you say, what affects that circuitry? And genes and environment, plus what you're ingesting in your body. Or then you and so it really I think it changes the game. Whereas heart just feels sort of like amorphous and out there. That's why many of you are studying, been in labs, like you're studying brain because it's affecting mood and decision making and everything else. This is not a heart lab. Heart's really important too. Okay. Heart's incredibly important. Heart health is good. We have heart health week too, but all right. I was supposed to give shorter answers. That didn't work, but
yeah, I appreciate that.
okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll just keep going. All right, Cameron, what do you got?
Hi, so this is more of a practical question, but given how many projects the lab's currently tackling, it's kind of hard to anticipate what you're looking for in research associates. So I was wondering if Yvonne, Emily, and McKenna could kind of speak to what their contributions have been on projects and maybe like what their favorite skills that they've acquired have been and what their experiences have been, just to get a better idea of what their step is.
Great question. Not for me to answer. All right, Emily, Yvonne, McKenna, any of you, what do you want to say?
I can speak a little bit. I just came on board a few months ago. So a lot of what I'm involved in is the career network kind of stuff, interdisciplinary collaborations between people who are doing this work that intersects neuroscience with architecture and with all these other fields. My own background is my undergrad was in biology with a concentration on endocrinology, as well as fundamentals, issues, and texts, which is kind of a literature-based philosophy program. I have a master's in science and bioethics from Columbia and a master's in medical sciences from Warren Alpert, the Medical School of Brown. So what I've really enjoyed about this lab so far is getting to speak to so many people who are kind of foundational in these emerging fields that intersect neuroscience with all these others. And I enjoy interacting with the other RAs, but also like longer term projects I haven't yet had a ton of experience with. So I think McKenna and Yvonne can speak more to that.
Yeah, so I suppose, there's been quite a few projects that I've been involved in. So I guess to tackle your question, one of the skills that I've acquired, I suppose, would be, I would honestly say patience, probably, because a lot of these tasks are ongoing. So I would say that patience and kind of seeing the final product. One thing that comes to mind is certainly the NeuroX event that took quite a bit of patience. There was a lot of build up, and then we got the final payoff. So I would say that's something. But I know you're looking for more hands-on skills. So I suppose writing is a big one. Dr. Shen, he kind of hammers that home a lot, and it's very important in almost every aspect of academia. So and even in the industry for a lot of these fields. So writing is always going to be a very important aspect. If you can demonstrate good writing abilities, then I think that's going to get you very far. I would say coding, although I don't believe, at least as far to my knowledge, there hasn't been any coding with respect to like programming, but just even like qualitative coding, qualitative analysis, that's going to be very important, especially when you're in these fields, like because law is a social science. So you're every now and then you're going to deal with qualitative data and even quantitative data. So that's a big one. I would say, what else comes to mind? Just also willingness to take on tasks that you may not be familiar with or even not comfortable with, because everything's important. Everything plays a part, no matter how small it may appear to be. So that's also something else. being able to effectively navigate the internet. I know that we use it all the time, but often it's not very precise. Right? When you really want to get in, find a piece of information, it can be quite difficult if you don't know where to go, how to navigate. So I suppose that would be important. What else? I believe that's all that comes to mind. I'd be happy to answer further when if you want to reach out, but that's what comes to mind for me. And then of course, just being able to take in different perspectives from different people. I think that's one of the great parts about the lab is that you have like Dr. Shen and Emily have touched on, you have people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of different maybe career interests. I mean, with particular commonalities with respect to law and neuroscience, but yeah, just being able to take in different viewpoints. I've learned quite a bit in this lab. So yeah, that's what I have.
McKenna, you gonna say anything?
Sure. I'll just say, echoing like a lot of what Yvonne says, I think it very much depends on the project that you're working on. So for instance, I'm on the career network, and a lot of what we do is a lot of outreach. So like reaching out to a lot of schools, trying to build relationships. I also work a lot on the website, and the newsletter that a lot of you guys, I'm sure, are subscribed to. So in terms of my specific role in the lab, it's definitely more like communications based. I would say, specifically on the career network project, but there's definitely like different opportunities and skill sets you'd use depending on like which grants you're on.
Yeah, so I'll say a few things just about hiring. So we're I always I mean I'm very explicit about and forthcoming about all this. We try and hire students who of course will help the various projects in the lab. Sometimes it's substantive knowledge, but a lot of times it's skills. So Emily and I have been working hard to find some folks who have some particular skills related to website, content management and kind of advanced knowledge. So that matters. We also try and balance what sort of the lab, what someone can do for the lab and what the lab can do for someone. So, sometimes there'll be an applicant who's won like every major award, it seems already. And yes, they'd be great in the lab, but they really don't need the lab. Like they already have connections to everyone they need. And we tend to I guess I make the final decisions, but I tend to want to find folks who also will gain a lot from the lab. So I don't think you'd mind me saying this, Yvonne, like at University of Oklahoma, there were no other law and neuroscience folks, right? Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, and you had mentioned that in your cover letter, and so it was very compelling that this would be an opportunity for someone who is really interested in the field and had just no other opportunity. And just the timing work. Sometimes it has to do with timing. A lot of it is timing. When did the grants come in? We've been waiting on some grants to to transpire, and they don't. Sometimes the other thing I'll say too is that I've really post-COVID found a lot of value in in-person connection. I think our lab will agree. So, we do socials, and that means that, I fly all the time. I'm over 2 million miles in my life now, going around 3 million because I ping pong between Boston and Minnesota. So those two locations or near those locations, that we do favor those applicants just because we found it really important as a team to be in a community together. And so, for instance, in Boston, it's last month or January, I forget, a few weeks ago, we got together and we did a service morning with one of our partners, which was a ton of fun. And as Emily and I will recall, we set a new record for one of our in our service. It was fun. So those are some of the factors that go in. But it's just a mix. Sometimes we have openings that are, it needs to be a student. Sometimes not. Sometimes it has to be like a law student because they're just things somebody asked us early on that even the brightest undergrad just won't know how to do because you haven't had the training yet in law that you get in law school or in medical school. We have programs, and then we're just limited in terms of numbers because I think everyone on this call and anyone in the lab would agree that hopefully that I'm very hands-on. We don't have a middle level. So some labs that are really big in the sciences, there's big boss, and then really, if you're, titrating stuff, you only talk to the postdoc. You rarely see big boss. There is no middle level here. So it's me and it's everyone else. And what that means is that we just don't bring in as many folks because it wouldn't be fair to bring someone in if there's not a lot of engagement. So we have these individualized development plans, which actually I can show a blank one of, which might be useful. I'd encourage, wherever you do an RA work, it's useful to have these and see if I've got the kind of example of that. Well, I'll look it up while we do these questions, but those are useful. We do those, and that's just a way of hiring very, very hopefully intentionally with an idea of what somebody's gonna do. We're too small a group to just sort of hire willy-nilly and say, oh, we got a team of 20 people to code. That's not, although I think there may be up to 20 people at different times that I meet with. Okay, so that's again a long answer, but great question. Okay, Tom.
Hey, Dr. Shen. So I was wondering about machine learning-based neuroscience research focused on an explicitly legal angle, which I know your lab doesn't do. And I was wondering, do you collaborate with any Boston area researchers that do that? And second part of the question is, do you see a potential ethical and legal privacy issue in terms of an informational overhang in contemporary brain data, where down the line, future machine learning models that have been trained on a larger corpus of data might be able to extract sensitive information from data that was collected today that people didn't realize they were actually revealing when it was collected. So you do a sleep EEG study, and then 30 years later, someone can tell from that EEG data that maybe you are a racist or something like that, which is then sensitive information and the potential privacy issue there.
Yeah, so I do think I'm just going to work in reverse order. There are really big privacy issues. I think so. I think they will become more poignant as we know what to do with brain data. So I think right now, if somebody took a structural MRI, I know I'm on record of saying this, take an MRI, take even fMRI in my brain. I mean, okay, and then we put it public. I mean, what are people going to do? I don't have, because I recently had MRI. I don't have any major tumors or anything, like, okay, that'd be different. But I think you're right that reanalysis of data, like what you're suggesting, and more granular data could become really important, and therefore really important for understanding who someone actually is. I don't think right now most brain scans tell us much. Again, with an important and notable exception, if there's a big mass there or something, or someone's, these rare instances where clinicians are trying to do some differential diagnosis. But by and large, I'd be much more concerned if someone had my search history and my emails and my text messages, that is my behavior, rather than my brain data. But that may well change. It may change in part. We're actually trying to get an article out called Deep Brain Evidence, where most brain evidence right now is surface level. And I mean that literally and figuratively. Literally because it's at the surface, EEG, or through the skull, fMRI or MRI. Figuratively in the sense that it's shallow because of that. But the advent of deep brain stimulation devices, especially the closed loop ones that are being used and developed for Parkinson's and other disorders, treatment-resistant depression and others, though the hallmark of those is 24/7 collection of data from limbic system, from deep inside and across the circuits. And I think that information could become very telling in future years. So yeah, I think privacy is a major concern for many in this field, and many have written on it. Nita Farahani, my colleague at Duke, wrote a nice book called The Battle for Your Brain, which I recommend, and it talked about company and government use of brain data from wearables and eventually implantables. Remind me your first question. Which types of collaborators were you asking about? It was in industry or with, just say it one more time.
Yeah, it was just Boston-based researchers using machine learning on neural data with an
yeah. So yeah, I mean, with a explicitly legal angle, you said at the end?
Yeah, just not kind of all the computational neuroscience people, but anyone who's really taking it and looking at the law with it.
Well, let me think about that. Yes and no. A lot of colleagues who are well aware that there could be legal implications of what they do. And like a colleague, not in Boston, but in New Mexico, Kent Keel is a neuroscientist. He's done wonderful work on psychopaths and others, but is a leading brain imager. And I think all the leading brain imagers are thinking carefully about the use of machine learning in their work now. And he's thought a lot about forensic use of neuroimaging. He's one of the leaders in that area. In Boston, well, we have a lot of people who come through the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. Probably should have mentioned them too. MJ at CLBB, I was the executive director of CLBB for several years and now serve as chief innovation officer. My colleagues, Dr. Judith Edersheim, is a forensic psychiatrist, Robert Kinshiff, clinical psychologist, and Bruce Price, neurologist. They run that shop, CLBB, mgh.clbb.harvard.edu, great group. And they're often running programs around neuroimaging and the law. So I don't have a single name for you, Tom, but I'll say that a lot of the so first of all, I think that most of the neuroimaging community is just well aware of if they're not explicitly on the cutting edge or using various machine learning techniques. I mean, they will. Surely all new cohorts are being trained up in that. And so then I think really the question will be, of the neuroimaging group, who starts to care about legal stuff? And I think that's going to be determined in large part by a few personalities who are going to take some risk and then eventually funding. Because right now, as I mentioned this before, NIH doesn't fund explicitly legal research. NIH is in the business of improving health. So that's why what I call the holy grail of neurolaw, which is brain-based lie detection, that I am going to try and go after too, because it's the holy grail, and why not? Everyone else has failed, but you think you're going to make it, NIH doesn't fund that. I've told them, I've been on record as saying you should fund this, but because I think brain-based lie detection would be the single most important advance in the history of the law. And I really mean that. And there have been examples, we teach it in our casebook, of brain-based lie detection proffered for use in court. I'm on record as saying they weren't ready yet, and I don't think they were. But to me, it's theoretically plausible. There have been a lot of, the MacArthur Foundation Law and Neuroscience Project, where I did my postdoc and where I owe a lot of my training to. We spent a lot of time on that issue, and this was in the early 2010s, like 2010, 2011, 2012. The science wasn't ready then. It's not quite ready yet, but one of the reasons it's not ready is no one's working on the issue. You can Google around right now, and I guarantee you're not going to find but a handful of labs, if that, and even then they kind of don't have a ton of bandwidth to do it because no one's funding it. Now I have a plan I won't go into it now. We're already over time, but that I think is the holy grail. I really do. Great question. And, check out our newsletters and stuff, because we'll try and highlight some more of that stuff. Adrian Rain is a neuroimager, not with really machine learning, at least not in the past, but at UPenn, he's done a lot of work. He wrote a book called The Anatomy of Violence, really looking at brain science and those who kill. Okay, sorry, I've been going over, but great question. Thank you. Okay, we can grab, I think, these four. So Nicole, Winnie, Anna, and Mai will go one by one. Nicole.
Yeah, I'm sorry for keeping everyone here.
That's okay.
Isn't as generally applicable to everyone, but I was wondering how people would go about developing legal standards to prevent bias in AI, like making sure they don't perpetuate prejudice with like biased training data. Because I was reading a lot about that and like AI psychiatry and how like they keep finding like the algorithms are racist because the training data can't not have prejudice because it's like human error. And so like how would we measure bias in AI? Like how would we have like a concrete criteria to like make an effective policy and like use it as a standard? And then like how do we even decide how much bias is acceptable? Like how do we draw that line?
Great question. So this is one of the hot questions in AI ethics and AI law right now. You got tons of government regulators and the Biden administration and all kinds of folks thinking about it. So let me give you just my 60-second assessment. First of all, I think that we need to be really precise when we talk about what bias means. So we have a paper we're working on right now called the subgroup problem. And what it observes, it's not a novel observation necessarily, but we think it's important in this context, is that when someone says bias, they generally mean in the AI context that, boy, the AI model was trained on people from groups A, B, and C, but not enough from group D. And therefore, when you apply it to group D, it could be biased because it's never seen group D, and group D may be really different than A, B, and C, something like that, right? And you can fill in the A's and the B's and the C's and D's with whatever social identifiers or population descriptors you want to. You trained it on kids, can you use it on adults or vice versa? Or you trained it on people from this country and not that country. Okay. So one challenge is that there are subgroups in all of those areas. So let's say you did get every, so the standard categories, we actually also have a piece on racial identifiers. The standard question that any of you who are in the United States have ever answered is, for your race and ethnicity question combo, was first Hispanic or non-Hispanic. Remember that? And then after you answer that question, yes or no, then you've got your 5 categories or maybe other. Well, that came from federal law. By the way, federal law that's being revised. Those are all, that's up for grabs. But even within those 5, let's say you've got a training data set that's like perfectly balanced on those 5 categories. But what if all your Asian category are just Japanese or just Chinese or just Filipino or just whatever? And then what if all your Chinese are just from one part of China? Does it matter? And that's really, to me, the critical question is, just because you train data on a data set that's non-representative doesn't necessarily mean it won't work later. And so the regulatory question is, how much evidence do you need before you let it out in the wild? Are you going to force it to go? Someone has invested their life fortune, their startup, and they train, and they've shown that it works on this group. Is a regulator say, no, you need to go 5 more years, and you need to, is that, and we've been asking this actually to the guest speakers, and it's been really interesting to hear their answers. Like, do you put the moratorium on it? Do you just use it cautiously? Do you just not care at all and let the market decide? Kind of like we were saying before, like, how much do you just let citizens say, well, okay, I know it wasn't trained on people like me, but I want to use it anyway, Off-label use of medicines is pretty common. For instance, drugs that were only approved for adults might, in some cases, physician might, use it on an adolescent. So these are really tough questions. I don't think they're new for regulators or for the law. And the answer of how it actually happens is a couple ways. So one is regulatory pathways. So the United States, at least for certain types of devices, and AI would qualify, certain types of medical devices, the FDA can just say, here are the requirements. And you can build that into requirements. Another way you can regulate is to bring civil penalties and to investigate. And you can bring civil lawsuits as well, just sort of discriminatory lawsuits. And then, of course, the third way is, well, there are more than 3, but a third way is more sort of outside the law, but more social pressure sorts of things. All these require some knowledge about how the AI was developed, some transparency. That's also a related and vexing question in these models. It's one thing if we have information, pretty full information about how a model was developed. And I think that's kind of, one of the things you're suggesting, Cole. We know it wasn't trained on all of these sorts of folks, only on this sort of folk. But what if you don't know anything about how it was trained at all? You just have its product. Like, how much do you need to know? So I think the regulatory pathways, the civil lawsuit sort of pathways, and there are state laws and federal laws that can be enacted. And then, you've got to decide, like, by way of analogy to other devices, it may be a bioethics principle that you want a new technology to help all. Most technologies don't help all. And many things are marketed specifically for, right, a certain population. So this is the heart of the matter. We talked all semester about it, and there's no easy answer, but people are thinking about it right now heavily. And so it's a space where things are happening. Good question. Okay, Winnie, thank you.
Okay. Hello. So my question does build off of Nicole's question around where the role of regulation comes in when AI is backwards facing. So when we also talked about the role of pain and pain biomarkers in the human brain, I guess we see this like backwards working of how neurotechnology and biomarkers is involved in monumental decisions such as Dobbs overturning Roe v. Wade. So also, I know that the law moves so fast, or it moves so slow because it's always applied in the same manner. It's always based on precedents. And our discussion was that AI is backward facing because so many of these algorithms are derived from existing data and outdated structures and social systems. So my question is, when we're talking about this regulation aspect and the question of whether or not we should proceed with caution or have a moratorium when the sample data is not completely representative, how is your lab and the work that your research assistants are doing and you personally prompting this paradigm shift from using backward-facing AI in criminal justice as beyond just making an outdated system more efficient, but propagating it toward reform and confronting algorithm bias and dehumanization. And I'm specifically interested in mitigating solitary confinement because I think so much of the research and data pulls from not represented groups to underpaint the harm that solitary confinement really presents and the current situation of the criminal justice system. So I'm really interested to see if I know the lab works on criminal justice and neurotechnology, but is there anything that you are currently working on or hoping to explore?
Yeah, so I'm finishing up a book that is long overdue on the justice system and technology, especially neurotechnology, but including AI as well. So let me give you the high level kind of points that I make, which are, it's my argument. It's not so in law, we argue in different ways than scientists argue. That is, we sort of come up with a vision of what we want to see the legal world look like, and then we accumulate evidence to try and support that point. Sometimes we do hypothesis testing in the lab, but this book is not like a hypothesis testing book. This book is a piece of legal advocacy. So my particular views are the following. So with respect to solitary confinement, I don't think we need, I don't think you need necessarily neuroscience as of course many have made the point well before neuroscience, that it's a really problematic practice. I'm really big on the idea that neuroscience adds value when behavioral data enough isn't alone. When behavioral data alone isn't enough. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that I think the onus and the burden is on law and neuroscience as a field, or me as an author, to say why we need to worry about neurons and dendrites and this sort of stuff without just seeing what the world looks like and seeing how someone is acting. You don't need neuroscience to just tell you, hey, kids are kind of different than adults. That's common experience, that we see it with our own eyes. And I think in solitary confinement, the behavioral data is really compelling, that it's really problematic process. And in a lot of other instances, I think that, frankly, neuroscience doesn't add a tremendous amount over and above the behavioral data. Doesn't mean the law shouldn't change from all that behavioral data. It should, but in some instances. So where do I think neuroscience matters a lot in criminal justice? I think it matters, and I actually think, and you asked about AI as well, so I'll try to touch on that. So I think with both neuroscience and AI, I would start, as I have a chapter in the book, with a lot of cautions, and to recognize that the basic idea that science will necessarily help the law and make it more just, that is not necessarily the case, and it's certainly not the case for neuroscience. There are lots of examples, and there's this quote that I use in my talks all the time and in the book, where at the time of the lobotomy, the Yale Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Harvard Law Review thought it was going to be the cure for many criminals. And you can understand why, because many of you, I don't know how many of you know this, the lobotomy wins the Nobel Prize. This is Igas Moniz, who's an amazing neuroscientist, and wins a Nobel Prize. And so you kind of have to imagine this dialogue where law's like, okay, hey, we can't solve this whole violence thing. but you're telling us neuroscience that every story is a brain story. Hey, where'd I hear that from? Good line. But they say, all right, yeah, and violence is a brain story too. Well, okay, you got anything to help? Yeah, we have this thing called lobotomy. Okay, like, but has it been verified, validated? What do you got? And Moniz is like, well, I have a Nobel Prize. Is that good enough for you? So even Nobel Prize winning science, when it has to do with this complex thing, the brain, that's why I go back to the very beginning. I was saying how the uncertainty around brain stuff is really at the center of this field. If we knew the violent circuits, it'd be super easy. No one would disagree. It'd be like, okay, flip the switch, modify the violent circuits so people are less violent. But it's not that easy. And when it's not that easy, you get these hypotheses or Nobel winning prize technologies that are like, hey, I know enough now. I know enough now to change the violent circuit. So I would start with the premise that it's really, really tough to understand the brain and therefore really tough to intervene in the brain. That's the starting point. And then I'd say, okay, but let's look at the places where the law is really poor in doing its job. The criminal law is really poor in doing its job. One way is making predictions about this rare violence is a rare event amongst human populations. Like intense violence is really rare. Most people don't kill. Most people don't do mass killings. Most even those with mental illness, the are not usually violent. That's why the mental health community, advocacy community, like always gets annoyed when the newspaper headline is, mass killer had untreated mental illness, because it seemed to suggest this connection that is much more tenuous. And so I think neurotechnology and AI actually too, if properly harnessed, has a role to play in better understanding why people do what they do. And therefore, at the individual level, it's got to be individualized. And therefore to have better, more personalized and individualized sentencing. Are there a lot of harms that could happen? Sure, absolutely. You've already named a couple. This came up before, the concern that it would, rather than be predicting based on sort of an individual's combination of genes, environment, and who they are, that in fact the algorithm would be picking up things that are much less amenable to individual intervention. Like maybe it's just picking up came from a certain zip code or something, right? And unless you're going to intervene, unless the intervention then is move someone to a different zip code. And that is the flip side that, by the way, I rarely hear when the concern is it's like, okay, then what is your intervention? So what's the answer? The answer to me is what I argue in the book, is to be aware of these concerns, but not to back off. Like, to me, it's to double down. I really believe in this stuff. So it's to double down on the research and actually to do some research in neuroscience and law. It's been a theme tonight. There's not much research in neuroscience and law. Almost all the neurolaw research is importing health research for purposes of law. It just is. NIH doesn't fund neurolaw research. NSF maybe a little. Worldwide, there are a few collaborations. There are some companies that try to do some of this stuff. But, you go out and find me right now. We could all search. We could search around. I've done it. I do it all the time. Companies investing in neurolaw, they don't exist. Our lab is kind of an outpost in this way. So I think a tremendous amount of research is needed, but I also think that there are some lower hanging fruits in the meantime, like ending solitary confinement seems pretty straightforward, unless you're going to be explicit and say, look, one of the purposes of punishment is to be incredibly punitive. And so just be clear that, okay, maybe you disagree with it, but at least you'll know. That, in other words, two people could agree that solitary confinement is really, really horrible and then disagree about whether it should be utilized. I think it's really tougher to disagree on the fact that it's really brutal punishment. I will say, though, that scientifically, it's harder to differentiate the marginal additional bad effect of being in solitary confinement as opposed to just being in confinement for a long period of time. And also the dosage effect is really hard. So we use it's kind of, is solitary confinement one day worse than 5 years of confinement? That's an empirical question. We don't have any data on that. Those sorts of questions are, so being precise about that sort of stuff, I think, is important too. And be interesting to see where it goes. I'll put a link into, is this it? Yeah, this was a neuroscience of solitary confinement thing that, sorry, I put it into the wrong thing, put it into everyone that CLBB did, a colleague of ours, Adam Horowitz did, might be of interest. Okay, who are we up to? We've got, is it Anna?
Yeah. Hi.
Okay.
Thank you so
Hi.
much for hosting the event. I'll keep it super brief. I was just curious, you mentioned moving a lot between Minnesota and Boston. And I was wondering how the lab just logistically manages that, if it's a lot of virtual, if there's some in-person events, and then if you have any advice going forward, if we're interested in the lab and have filled out the Google form. That was
Okay, yeah, great questions.
Yeah.
I'm glad we reached them. I should have made a note to reach them earlier. So we've been virtual since before COVID. And the reason is that what I mentioned before, that if I were to limit it to just one or even two cities, the two cities that I spend most of my time in, it would not fulfill this. Well, two things. One, we limit our pool. So they're really cool folks from across the country and the world. We tend to be in the United States. I will say that. It has a lot to do with logistics, time zones. I like people every week at weekly lab meetings. It also has a lot to do that we collaborate with others who do work under EU law, work in Asia, work in very many countries in Africa, but we ourselves as a lab don't have expertise and specialty in that. So we are, that's generally our scope. So we were virtual before COVID, we've been virtual, but as I was saying before, I've found a lot of value in having in-person meetings along the way. But at the same time, we have our weekly virtual meeting. The cornerstone is attendance at the weekly lab meeting, and then we have additional meetings like for various projects along the way. That's how the logistics have worked. They've worked really well like that for forever, really. So I think we'll kind of keep that up. Our numbers allow that to happen. We've always been in the 8 to 20 range, but never like when it's 20, it's like different configurations. Like right now, I've got one student on an independent study, a couple students who just are like on one project. They don't come to lab meetings, so we're just finishing up an article. The core group who's at the lab meeting, the group on the career network, a colleague we wrapping up some sports concussion work with. So it's just like a lot of different pieces. And then the second question, so if anyone is listening to this, or if you're on the call now and you've applied, thank you. We are trying to get through reviewing all the applications now, and we'll follow up. We just don't have enough spaces. I wish we had more, but our process is pretty straightforward. We just do an initial round of Zoom interviews. Emily might do the first round this year, or we'll combine, and then we do a second interview. We've got all the materials we ask for, and then we just make some decisions. And it's our mid-March. We'll try and make those by the end of March. Everyone's trying to figure out their summer. We're probably even a little behind. But as I said, it's kind of contingent on grants. Like everyone in the lab knows because they follow this week to week. We've had grants come and go, and we thought we were going to get them, and that has a big impact on what hiring we can do. So that's it. There's no, I mean, if you haven't received an email confirmation, I think we tried to send a mass email out, right, Emily, to everyone who's applied. They just got it. I mean, you can ask Emily. If you send me a note, I just forward it to Emily. She's tracking who's incoming, and she'll let you know. Volunteer. We don't accept volunteers except for I've made just a very rare exception over the years because it's hard to pay a high school student. This high school student is a good fit. And why don't we accept volunteers? A couple of reasons. One, probably because I'm from law and a labor law family. Like I generally don't like the idea of people working for free. The other reason is that I found over the years that and again, because remember, everyone in our lab is doing something else. Almost everyone. And we've got Emily full time. So almost everyone else is doing something else. And especially if you're students, your something else includes going to school, maybe applying to medical school or law school or whatever else. And so the first thing to go is going to be your volunteer work. It just always is. So we have not had good experiences with volunteers, and we're just kind of limited. So we pay. We do set up arrangements every once in a while for course credit. That's usually pretty tough if you're not at one of the schools I teach at, just because of the way course credit tends to work. And we try and find sometimes other creative ways to get people in the door. But yeah, we're just kind of limited in how many we can bring in. But we bring in as a cohort for the summer, and then we try and keep most of that cohort through the year if we can. It's just easier for everyone if there's some consistency. But we do re-up usually the start of the semesters, especially the fall, more so than the spring, because by spring, it's winter, we're in the middle of it. But then we gear up for the summer. So that's what we're doing. Good question. Thanks. I'm sure others had it too. Okay, last two questions. Mai.
Hi. I heard from what you were talking about regarding to like Nicole's question about racial biases, and you mentioned that just because the training data isn't representative doesn't mean that it can't be used. And I want to ask this question, especially in particular to like digital psychiatry. And I just wanted to know like what your thoughts are on like, because cross-cultural research on diagnoses are so different, and it's such a heavily debated topic because not every culture can use the same kind of diagnoses for like the same disorder. So I was just wondering like what your thoughts are on that in relation to like digital psychiatry and using AI in diagnoses.
McKenna, Yvonne, you want to say anything? You've just coded a bunch of articles on this very topic. I mean, I'm happy to say something.
Sorry, it cut out. I don't believe McKenna's here though.
Oh, okay. McKenna had to leave. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just say that we're doing a scoping review on ethical and legal issues associated with digital psychiatry, a digital phenotyping in psychiatry. So for those who don't know, I referenced this earlier. One of the trajectories in psychiatry is to use objective digital data to improve psychiatric diagnosis and disease progression. So, for instance, rather than coming in and saying to your clinician, saying, "Hey, how you been sleeping? Oh, pretty good." Instead of that exchange, it's let me look at your sleep tracking for the last three months and know exactly how you have been sleeping. That would be an example of digital phenotyping. But then that data is going to be used for setting diagnoses, assessing, and treatment plans and the like. And what if all the clinical work has been done in Boston, Massachusetts? Not, just if I were to randomly pick a city in McLean Hospital population. And I think your question is, okay, so they get it working there. Can you just like up and use that in insert other country or frankly other region of the United States here? And I think it's a difficult question because the empirical possibilities are whatever they found is going to be generalizable to a whole bunch of humans. Like sometimes a brain is a brain is a brain, a mind is a mind is a mind, and it doesn't really matter whether you did 100 people in Boston or 100 people in Shanghai or 100 people in Johannesburg or wherever. But then other times, and you're picking up on this cross-cultural psychiatry issue, it totally matters. So that's something you develop, and I'm even setting aside the language barriers, so let's say that you've done your language translation, but because of the way, and psychiatry is an inherently social discipline, because of the way that humans interact in culture A, the technology or the approaches set aside the technology, we already know the existing literature, I think is what you're referencing, that psychiatric treatment approaches in culture A may not work in culture B, and sometimes will have the wrong effect in culture B. But it's an empirical question. And so I think it goes back to this kind of regulatory sense of, okay, you've only shown it can work with this group. What does that mean for where else it can or should be used? And our own view is, at least my own view, is that you've got to strike some middle ground. I think it would be a mistake to say to that group at a hospital in Boston, you should not use this technology or translate it anywhere else unless you've replicated your entire study in this other place. On the other hand, I think it's really problematic to assume and to simply sort of forge forward and say, aha, we've got it, we're done, we don't need any more studies. So I would find some middle ground. And I guess I'd say my own personal view is we ought to be cautious, but we ought not to be overly cautious. And that's a hard line. And maybe it feels like a cop-out answer because you're like, well, okay, yeah. What do you think, Mai? You sound like you've thought about this.
I think there definitely should be a middle ground that is reached because, like you said, like with globalization and everything, the data from other countries themselves are changing from what they used to be like 20 years ago. So there, I completely agree that, there should be a middle ground where, we try new things, but we don't get presumptuous or arrogant with the data that comes back. And there are also like neurobiological differences from different cultural populations. So those are also like important aspects to consider, but I definitely also think that it's important to try things out and see how it goes.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add, I should have added at the very beginning, because we do a lot of this, or emphasize the need for it at least, is to be community engaged in these sites. So it's not a decision necessarily for the doctor or the research or the psychiatrist to make. It's a decision to make in tandem with the community, and informed decision that the community says, okay, yeah, let's have some meetings with that group in Boston. Let's bring them out here. Let's have them prove to us that it's what, and let's have them develop a sustained plan for being like, that's, I think, a lot better than just sort of like, sending it around without these careful considerations. Okay, Christopher, just before we get to you, I want to just answer this question because I'll forget about it. And it's a nice one in the chat, which basically asks, can you please discuss what are some skills that the lab is looking for if newcomers to the field have opportunities to work? Okay, so writing is number one, far and away. That is the most, well, actually, okay, this constellation of skills. So being able to work independently, being a part of our team. I mean, we are a really small group. I think we get along really well. And so that matters a ton. So collegiality. But writing is a tremendously important skill. That's what we do the most. And everyone's writing gets better. I mean, it's just the way we operate. It's just track changes. It's also what I do with my colleagues. We are just always writing. Writing is how the law works. We say things and we write things down, and then sometimes we listen to others, read others. So the written and the spoken word is really important, especially the written word. We don't care about like lab bench skills. I don't care if I don't even titration. It doesn't really even matter to us too much. If you have high-end engineering skills or technical skills, I say too much. It's relevant in the sense that it can be really useful to have that knowledge base, but the skill itself isn't as much. A lot of our work is communication work. And so communication skills in the sense of like McKenna has become our poster maven, she's not on here right now, but we grant writing, we're supporting our grant writing, which is back to writing, and just having some sense of how it all goes together. Yeah, so I think that stuff all matters. All right, this has got to be the last question, Christopher, and then we're going to call it a night.
Okay, sorry, very briefly. So I know that your lab is doing like law and also neuroscience and technology, but also you have already been involved or like doing a lot of different fields and different collaborations. Maybe if you can elaborate, how do those collaborations actually born? Like who initiated it? Is that like you as, like as the lab owner basically?
Yeah, great
And
question.
or is like an RA or can RAs also like initiate something that is like, let's say something is novel or like something is not has been done yet in the lab, or is it possible like that, or like how has it been done? So
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give two levels of answers. A great question. So how do these collaborations happen in general? Like how do lawyers and neuroscientists or neuroethicists and neuroscientists get in the same room? So it takes a lot of networking, and I have knocked on a lot of doors. I've sent a lot of emails in my life, cold emails, cold door knocking. We're like, hi, you don't know me, but and then I do all my best networking skills, but we have a friend in common, etc. The entire multi-million-dollar NIH grant around portable MRI started from an email that I sent to a colleague here at UMN. He didn't know me. We had a friend in common, and he was willing to meet with me, and we just hit it off. And sometimes you hit it off, and don't hit it off, it doesn't go anywhere. So a lot of the times those meetings start from sort of just a lot of old school networking, going to meetings, going to conferences, hearing a presentation. I'll go up to someone and say, I'm really following your work on on biomarkers and Alzheimer's disease. Have you thought about the legal implications? You've all the ethical implications. And then after a while, I think now we're at the point where people come find us. I'll get emails and say, hey, we saw your work. We're interested. Would you be interested in collaborating? So that's how it builds at that level. But it's just a lot of emails and calls and meetings and meeting people in person and building up a trust, and also clarifying to them that at least our approach is, I hope there's nothing I've said tonight that would give the sense that we're like anti-neuroscience or anti-AI or anti-progress. We're like, we want better neuroscience. More representative neuroscience, more inclusive neuroscience is better neuroscience, in my view. Community engaged neurotech development is better neurotech and a better world, in my view. So I'm pro technology development and pro AI development. I really like all this stuff. But I think that without attention to the legal and ethical issues, these technologies won't reach their potential. Okay, so that's one answer. But then you asked a different version of the question, which was, all right, what if an RA has an idea? So there, the answer is a little bit different. When I supervise academic projects, like I've meetings with people who have, and at law school, people write 3L papers, or in master's programs, it might be a master's thesis or a capstone. So that's the place where students, or if an independent study, are most free to come up and say, can you supervise this? You have interest in supervising this, and that's really their idea. Otherwise, in the lab, and it's large part because of the way we're funded, these are grant-funded mechanisms, and so we've promised our funder we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And so someone's got to come in and work on X, Y, or Z, not something else. That said, I think, Emily, you'd agree there's a lot of freedom in sort of how to do these things, whether it's the career network or this other work. So there's a kind of a mix and match. And the RAs got together and did this own thing on their own, which is great. So it's not, we go in a lot of different directions. I learned a ton from our RAs, my RAs, everyone in the lab. We and there's a lot of co-learning together, like even simple things like what newsletter program are we going to use. We went through we tried 3 different ones. They took forever. We finally learned. So we learned together on a lot of these things. The scoping review, that was driven by our RAs, in part the technology part, because they had used some programs that I hadn't been familiar with. They're like, hey, I really should be using this. I'm like, okay, great. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think, joint learning. And there's some opportunity to kind of show up and have a new idea for sure, but we are often constrained by our grants when I'm hiring someone. And again, that's different when it's like an independent academic project, like a master's thesis or a senior thesis, or obviously a dissertation or anything like that. So then things are a little bit different. Okay, everyone, thanks so much for kicking off Brain Awareness Week. We went over time, but I think that's okay. We recorded it, so if you're watching at home, thanks for watching at home. And don't be a stranger. I'm sorry we can't hire everyone in lab. So if you applied, and you're always welcome to apply again or check in again. That happens a lot as well. So and we're doing in-person in Boston on Tuesday, get the date. If you're in Boston, Tuesday, April 2nd, and we'll do something in person in Minnesota, but we may wait until the fall for that, or over the summer. So great to see everyone. Thanks so much, and have a good night. I'm going to end the meeting. Take care.